The Galactic Council dispatched assassins, humanity unleashed a nightmare instead. The chamber was already voting when I walked in. I was not supposed to be there. My clearance only covered the outer observation ring, a narrow glass corridor where diplomats stood like fish pressed against an aquarium wall, watching the council deliberate. But the lock on the inner door had malfunctioned 3 weeks ago, and the maintenance crew from the Sandraki Union had not arrived yet, and I had learned a long time ago that a broken lock is not a barrier. It is an invitation. My name is Yael Dross. I am 34 years old. I am a human, which, as of 6 minutes ago, had officially become the galaxy's most inconvenient problem. The council chamber on Vethera Prime was enormous. The ceiling was so high that the top of it disappeared into a manufactured haze, a soft blue mist the Vethkari kept at all times to simulate the atmosphere of their home world. 17 species sat in a curved arc of raised platforms, each one facing a central podium that was currently empty. They did not need a speaker. They were not debating. They were finishing. I pressed myself against the inner wall and listened. The Velhari ambassador spoke first. She was tall, narrow, with skin the color of old copper, and she spoke in the common tongue with an accent that made every word sound like the closing of a door. The motion carries, she said. 17 in favor. 0 in opposition. 0 abstaining. 0 abstaining. Every single species in that room had agreed. I did not move. I barely breathed. A human diplomat having a quiet anxiety episode in the corner of the Galactic Council's inner chamber was not exactly the opening act of a political crisis, but I was already calculating what came next, because that is what humans do. We do not pause. We do not process at our leisure. We calculate, immediately, automatically, the way our bodies regulate temperature without being asked. The motion was simple. The language was clean and bureaucratic, the way very terrible things always are. It had been titled Directive 7, Anomalous Species Containment Protocol. It did not mention Earth by name anywhere in its 42 clauses. It did not need to. There was only one species in the galaxy classified as a Category 7 anomaly. They were not declaring war. That would have been straightforward. War has rules. War requires acknowledgement that the other side exists as something worth fighting. What the Council had passed was quieter than war. It was the kind of decision you make when you want a problem to stop without having to explain why you solved it. They had contracted the Velhari Syndicate. I had known the syndicate by reputation only, the way you know the name of a storm before it arrives. They were not soldiers. They were not an army. They were a guild, and their specialty was the kind of work that never appeared in official records. They had operated across 9 systems. In 8 of those systems, they had resolved political complications so cleanly that the complications were never mentioned again. The 9th system had tried to renegotiate after the fact. The 9th system now had a different government. And now they had a contract with humanity's name on it. Not a war. Not an invasion. A list. I did not have the list. I did not know how long it was. But I understood its logic. If you want to stop a species from becoming a problem, you do not eliminate the species. You eliminate the people who make the species coherent. Leaders. Scientists. The people who hold threads together. Cut enough threads and the fabric falls apart on its own. It was, I had to admit, a very efficient plan. I had 72 hours before the Council would formally notify the syndicate that the vote had passed and the contract was active. I knew this because I had read the procedural charter for Directive 7 during the 3 months I had spent quietly accessing files I was not authorized to access, in the empty hours between diplomatic receptions when everyone assumed I was sleeping. I had not been sleeping. I had been reading. The chamber was beginning to clear. Delegates were moving toward their private exits. I turned, walked back through the broken door, down the glass corridor, past the 2 Sandraki guards who never once looked at me because I had spent 8 months making sure they found me boring, and I went directly to the communications bay that the human delegation shared with 3 other minor species on the building's lower level. I had 4 minutes before the bay's monitoring cycle refreshed. I sat down, opened the transmission panel, and looked at the keypad. I had a message ready. I had been composing it in my head for 3 months, a long and detailed message that covered everything I knew, everything I suspected, everything the Council had said in rooms I was not supposed to be in. It was thorough. It was precise. It covered 16 pages in my head. I had 4 minutes. I typed one word. Nightmare. Then the comms went dark. Not a power failure. A cut. Clean, deliberate, and instantaneous. Someone had been watching. Someone had known I was there. I sat in the silence of the dead terminal and thought about what that meant. It meant they already knew I had seen the vote. It meant they were not worried about one word reaching Earth. They thought one word was not enough to matter. I let myself smile, just slightly, just for a moment, in the dark of that empty room. They had never met the people who designed the Nightmare Protocol. I had sat in a basement room in Geneva with those people, 6 years before my posting to Vethera Prime. I had watched a 60-year-old man named Colin Gray draw a single diagram on a whiteboard and explain, in a quiet voice, what 30 years of patient preparation looked like when it finally had reason to move. They thought one word was not enough. They were wrong. I stood, straightened my uniform, and walked out of the communications bay to find something to eat, because I had a feeling it would be a very long few days, and I have always thought better when I am not hungry. Outside, Vethera Prime's twin suns were setting. The sky turned a deep, bruised violet, and the city lights below the council complex began to glow. It was beautiful, the way many things are beautiful just before they change completely. The word was traveling at the speed of the relay network. It would arrive on Earth in approximately 11 hours. And when it did, something that had never been announced, never been officially recorded, and never once stopped being maintained, would begin to move. They sent assassins because they thought they understood what we were. They had never once asked what we had already built. The first Velhari team landed in London at 3:14 in the morning, local time. I know this because it was in the debrief I received 11 days later, sitting in a small room in Portsmouth with a cup of tea I did not remember making, reading a document so dense with operational detail that it took me 4 hours to finish it. By the time I was done, the tea was cold and I had stopped being surprised by anything. The London team was good. I want to be clear about that, because the story does not work properly if you think of the Velhari as amateurs. They were not amateurs. Their lead operative had 19 years of field experience across 6 systems. She had successfully completed 41 contracts. She spoke 7 languages, including English, with no detectable accent. She had memorized the floor plans of her target building down to the location of the fire extinguishers. Her name, we learned later, was Sorvith. She never used a last name. The syndicate considered last names a security risk. Sorvith and her team of 4 moved through the London streets at the right pace, wearing the right clothes, carrying the right equipment. They did not look out of place. They had been briefed extensively on human urban movement patterns. They knew to walk at a specific speed, to avoid direct eye contact with security cameras, to take routes that kept them in the natural flow of pedestrian traffic even at 3 in the morning. They arrived at the target building at 3:31. The target building was a converted townhouse in a quiet street near Kensington. It had been the official residence of Deputy Undersecretary Clarence Hall for the past 4 years. Clarence Hall was 58, slightly overweight, spent most of his weekends gardening, and was, on paper, a mid-level bureaucrat in the Ministry of Strategic Liaison, which was a real department that did real work and was absolutely not a cover for anything at all. Sorvith's team entered through a side passage that surveillance mapping had identified as a blind spot. They were inside for 40 seconds before everything stopped working. Not the lights. The lights stayed on. Not the cameras. The cameras kept running. What stopped working was the team itself. Sorvith later described it, in the quiet and exhausted tones of someone who has completely revised their understanding of a situation, as walking into a room that had already accounted for every decision she could possibly make. Clarence Hall was not in the building. Clarence Hall had not been in the building for 9 days. The building was occupied by 3 people from a department that, again, did not appear on any official record, who had been sitting in a comfortable living room waiting, with great patience, for exactly the kind of team that had just walked through the side passage. Those 3 people were not soldiers. I want to be clear about this too, because the image people have when they hear the phrase covert operation is usually large and dramatic. The 3 people in that building were as follows: a 53-year-old woman named Dorothy Ives, who had spent 26 years in signals analysis and had retired to grow herbs on her windowsill until the Nightmare Protocol activated; a 60-year-old man named Arthur Penn, who had once been responsible for the logistical planning of 3 simultaneous extraterrestrial contact operations and currently enjoyed birdwatching on weekends; and a 29-year-old named Leo Grant, whose Specific skills I am still not fully cleared to understand, but whose contribution to the evening was apparently decisive. Sorvatha's team was contained in under 4 minutes. Contained. Not harmed. Not eliminated. Contained, separated, and placed in comfortable rooms with water and a meal, because the Nightmare Protocol's operational guidelines were very specific about the treatment of captured operatives. The guidelines had been written by people who understood that information is more valuable than retaliation, and that a comfortable prisoner who is confused is far more useful than an uncomfortable one who is angry. This was happening simultaneously in 14 other cities. Nairobi, Oslo, Sydney, Toronto, Cairo, Singapore, Buenos Aires, Dublin, Lisbon, Mumbai, Seoul, Amsterdam, Montreal, and a small town in New Zealand called Oamaru that the Velhari team assigned to it had apparently spent considerable time trying to locate on a map. 17 Velhari teams. Each one composed of experienced, well-briefed, capable operatives. Each one walking into a building where their target had been absent for days. Each one encountering a version of Dorothy Ives and Arthur Penn, people who were retired, or apparently retired, or working jobs that sounded unremarkable, and who had been quietly prepared for this exact scenario since before some of the Velhari operatives had begun their careers. The targets were gone. All of them. Every name on the Velhari list had vacated their usual location within 6 hours of my signal reaching Earth. Not in a panic. Not in a chaotic scramble. In a measured, pre-planned, practiced sequence that left no sign of urgency, because urgency leaves traces and the people who designed this protocol did not like traces. In their places were individuals whose job was to be present, unremarkable, and observant. In London, Dorothy Ives and her team. In Nairobi, a retired logistics coordinator named Benedict Osei and 2 colleagues whose names I have not been given. In Seoul, a woman named Grace Yoon who had spent 30 years cataloging communication patterns between species and had an almost supernatural ability to make people feel at ease, which, as it turned out, was exactly the right skill for the situation. In Oamaru, a man named Paul Hendy who had been waiting so long that he had built a small greenhouse while he waited and grown 11 varieties of tomato. The Velhari operatives were not processed as prisoners of war. They were not charged with any crime under Earth's legal system, which would have required explaining the situation publicly. They were, instead, housed comfortably, given accurate information about their situation, and interviewed at length by people who were very good at listening. What the interviews produced was extraordinary. The syndicate's briefing materials on humanity were meticulous in some areas and almost laughably wrong in others. They had excellent data on human biology, population distribution, political structures, and communication systems. They had almost no useful data on human institutional memory. They had assumed, in the way that many species assume, that humanity's tendency to change governments, restructure organizations, and publicly argue about everything meant that we did not retain coherent long-term planning capacity. They had not accounted for the people who work below the level of governments. They had not accounted for Dorothy Ives, who had been receiving a very small quarterly payment from a very small account for 26 years, and who had kept her skills current not because she was ordered to, but because she found them interesting. They had not accounted for Arthur Penn, who had organized the Nightmare Protocol's logistical framework as a personal project over a decade, updating it every 6 months, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was, in his words, a fascinating puzzle. They had not accounted for Paul Hendy growing tomatoes in Oamaru. The syndicate's model of humanity was of a species that was capable and energetic but fundamentally reactive. They would respond to pressure. They would adapt to circumstances. But they would not have prepared for something they did not know was coming. Except that humanity has been preparing for things it does not know are coming since before it had cities. The earliest humans alive existed on a planet that tried to end them every single season. Ice. Drought. Predators with better teeth and faster legs. Disease without names. The galaxy looked at that history and called it chaos. It was not chaos. It was curriculum. Every generation learned from the last one's near misses, and the lesson was always the same: the threat you do not see coming is the one that ends you, so you build systems that work even when you do not know the shape of the threat yet. The Nightmare Protocol was not a plan for this specific moment. It was a plan for the shape of this kind of moment. And it had been sitting, quietly maintained, carefully updated, never once officially acknowledged in any document accessible to Galactic Council monitoring systems, for 31 years. On the morning after the Velhari teams were contained, the feeds from Earth went out on the Galactic Relay Network as normal. They were not emergency signals. They were not military communications. They were the ordinary morning feeds. Economic data. Weather patterns. Cultural broadcasts. The same streams that had been flowing from Earth since humanity had joined the network. Completely calm. As if nothing had happened. Which was, of course, the point. Somewhere in the Velhari Syndicate's headquarters, someone was waiting for confirmation that 17 operations had been completed. They were receiving silence, and then normal traffic, and the silence inside the normal traffic was beginning to feel wrong in a way that was very hard to explain. I was, at this point, still on Vethera Prime. I had been confined to the human delegation's quarters after the communication terminal incident, which suited me perfectly because confined to quarters still meant access to the internal network. The internal network, if you knew where to look, contained a great deal of information that was technically available to any registered diplomat. I was reading everything I could find. I was also, in the evenings, playing a card game in the common room with two delegates from the Theric Collective, who were perfectly pleasant company and had no idea that I was processing the complete structural breakdown of the Galactic Council's most significant covert operation while teaching them the rules of rummy. On the fourth day, the Syndicate's official liaison visited the council chamber and asked, very quietly, whether the Directive 7 operation had perhaps been paused. The council told him it had not. He went back to his office. I watched him go from the observation corridor, through glass that no longer required a broken lock because I had fixed it from the inside 3 days prior so that it would open from my side and appear locked from the other. His name was Pravath. He walked back to his office with the careful posture of someone who has just been told something that does not match the information they already have, and is not yet sure which source is wrong. I felt something that was not quite sympathy but was adjacent to it. He had been hired by people who thought they understood us. Those people had never talked to Dorothy Ives. I sent the broadcast from the human delegation's communications terminal on the 12th day. By that point I had been officially confined to quarters for a week, then unofficially ignored for 4 days, which is what happens in bureaucratic spaces when the crisis everyone expected does not arrive and the people managing it are not sure what to do with the person they were managing it around. The guards assigned to the human wing had been reassigned. The monitoring on the terminal had lapsed. It is remarkable how quickly administrative attention wanders when nothing is going wrong in any visible way. The file I sent was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was 312 pages of documentation, organized clearly, with a table of contents and indexed references. It contained the full text of Directive 7. It contained the recording of the council vote, including audio, which I had captured on a personal device that was technically a music player but had been modified by someone whose name I had never been given and whose work I had been grateful for every day of my posting. It contained the names of every delegate who had voted in favor. It contained the contract number issued to the Velhari Syndicate. It contained the operational parameters of what had been commissioned. It also contained, in a separate section clearly labeled as supplementary context, a brief summary of what had happened to the 17 Velhari teams on Earth. No sensitive details. Just outcomes. Contained. Unharmed. Interviewed. Cooperative. I sent it to every registered diplomatic address in the Galactic Relay Network. Every species with a seat at the council. Every species without a seat. Every research station, every trade outpost, every independent relay hub that passed traffic without affiliation. Then I made a cup of tea and waited. The first response came from the Theric Collective. It arrived 40 minutes after transmission, which meant they had read very quickly, or had already been watching for something like this. The message was short. It said, "We have information you will want to see. We have been waiting for someone to start this conversation." That was the moment I understood that this was larger than I had known. I had been thinking of Directive 7 as an action taken against humanity. It was, but it was not only that. The Velhari Syndicate was not new. The Council's habit of quiet removal was not new. Humanity was simply the first species that had the documentation and the intact structure to say something about it in a public forum where it could not be quietly suppressed. The Theric Collective had been watching the Council use the Syndicate for 30 years. So had the Murini Assembly. So had a small species called the Yeth, who had no seat on the council and no military capacity and had spent 2 decades carefully not drawing attention to themselves after watching what happened to species that drew attention to the wrong things. Within 6 hours of my broadcast, I had 11 responses. Not all were friendly. 3 were threatening, phrased in the careful language of diplomatic protocol so that they technically were not threats but communicated the concept with complete clarity. 4 were neutral, acknowledging receipt without commitment. But 4 were substantive. Species that had things to say. Species that had been waiting for a moment that looked exactly like this one. And then, on the 14th hour, I received a message from a source I had not expected. It was from Pravath. Not from the syndicate. From Pravath personally, using an address that was not his official channel and had, based on the routing metadata, been relayed through 3 separate independent hubs to obscure its origin. The message was 3 sentences. The contract was not the first one. There are records. I am not the only one inside this organization who is tired of the records. I read it 3 times. I thought about Sorvath, sitting in a comfortable room in London, being offered a meal by Arthur Penn. I thought about the syndicate's liaison walking back to his office with his careful posture and his mismatched information. I thought about the fact that no institution is a single thing. Every organization is a collection of individual people, and individual people have their own calculations to make. The syndicate had been built on discretion and results. Now their results had not arrived, their discretion had been broken wide open, and the people inside who had their own private ledgers of what they had witnessed were doing their own arithmetic. I wrote back to Pravath. I kept it short. I said, "Send me what you have. I will make sure it is seen." He sent it within the hour. It was 41 pages. Dense and specific. It contained contract logs going back 19 years, listing species and operations and outcomes, and several of those outcomes matched things that the galactic community had been told were internal political collapses or natural leadership transitions. They were not natural. I added Pravath's documents to a second file, clearly labeled as originating from a syndicate source, with his identifying information removed at his request. I sent that file to the same distribution list with a cover note explaining its provenance. The response this time was faster and significantly louder. The Murini Assembly issued a formal statement within 3 hours. They called for an emergency session of the Council's oversight mechanism, which had technically existed for 40 years but had never been convened because the Council itself controlled the conditions for convening it. The Theric Collective co-signed the statement. The Yeth, very quietly, added their name. Inside the Council chamber, I was told later, the atmosphere had changed completely. The Vethkari delegate, whose species was the oldest in the chamber and who had, in 30 years of watching diplomacy, developed an extremely accurate sense of when a situation had become irreversible, called an informal session that was not on the official schedule. I was not present for it. But I had, in the weeks of my confinement, developed a reliable secondary source inside the building's administrative staff. A young file coordinator named Ada Marsh had been assigned to the human delegation 3 years ago and had never quite lost the human habit of noticing things and finding them worth mentioning. Ada told me afterward that the informal session was quiet. No raised voices. No dramatic declarations. Just 17 species looking at the table in front of them and doing the same calculation at slightly different speeds. The calculation was this: the document I had sent was now distributed across thousands of relay points. It could not be recalled. It could not be suppressed. Every diplomatic corps in the galaxy had a copy. The information existed now in the way that information exists when it has been sent to too many places to contain, which is to say, permanently. The Council could respond in one of 2 ways. They could contest the documents, which would require explaining why the recording was false, which would draw more attention to everything they would prefer not to have attention drawn to. Or they could acknowledge the situation and attempt to manage it. Acknowledgement was not comfortable. But it was survivable. The Velhari Syndicate's contract was, within 48 hours of my broadcast, formally voided by the syndicate itself. No explanation. No public statement. A single line of administrative notation that said the contract had been withdrawn due to a conflict of operational parameters. It was the most diplomatic way of saying, we walked in and the building already knew we were coming, and we are not willing to write that in the official record. I read the notification in the empty communications bay and allowed myself, very briefly, to close my eyes. We were not done. Not even close. But the first piece had moved. The council chamber was full when I walked in. Not just the 17 seated species. Every observation gallery was occupied. Every available space in the outer corridors held delegations who had no formal seat but had traveled to Vethra Prime in the 3 weeks since my broadcast, because what was about to happen did not have a name yet in galactic diplomatic language, but everyone with any instinct for history knew they wanted to be present when it did. I was alone. The human delegation had offered to send a full diplomatic team. Ambassador Lorraine Crisp, our senior representative, had prepared a 17-page strategic brief and had practiced her opening remarks for a week. She was excellent. She was exactly the right person to lead a formal negotiation under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. The message I had received from Veritha's office 2 days prior had been addressed to me specifically. Not the delegation. Not the ambassador. The request had been polite and indirect in the way that all Vethkari communication is polite and indirect, but its meaning was clear. They wanted the person who had sent the broadcast. The person who had been in the room during the vote. The person who had sat across from Verith and spoken about patience. Lorraine had looked at me across her desk for a long moment when I told her this. "Do you know what you are walking into?" she said. "Not entirely," I said. "But I know what I want to walk out with." She nodded. She handed me a small card with a single line of text in her handwriting. The line said, "Remember that you represent everyone behind you." I carried the card in my jacket pocket all the way through the building and into the chamber. The chamber was different from the first time I had stood in it. That time it had been the controlled atmosphere of a concluded vote, everyone in their places, the decision already made. Today the energy in the room was different. Less certain. The kind of energy a room has when many powerful people are in the same space and none of them are sure who holds the advantage. I walked to the central podium. It was designed for speakers twice my height, and I had been offered a platform to stand on, which I declined. I stood at floor level, looking up at the curve of 17 elevated platforms, and I did not feel small. I had been preparing this moment in small pieces for 6 years, and the thing about preparation is that it does not make you taller. It makes you steady. I did not use notes. I said, 3 weeks ago, this council voted to have a private contractor remove 17 human beings from their positions and their lives. You called it a containment protocol. I want to spend some time today talking about what was actually being contained. The chamber was completely quiet. Human life expectancy, I said, is approximately 80 years. Many species in this room live 3, 5, 10 times that length. From the outside, 80 years probably looks like barely enough time to learn anything. It looks like the disadvantage. And the Council's assessment of humanity leaned heavily on that interpretation. Short-lived. Impulsive. Unpredictable. Too emotional to be stable. Too adaptive to be managed. I paused. What you missed, I said, is what 80 years does to a species when every generation knows it has to pass something on. When you have 80 years, you do not accumulate wisdom slowly over centuries and keep it inside your own head. You write it down. You build institutions. You create systems specifically designed to outlast you, because you are aware, at a very young age, that you will not be there forever. Every human who has ever worked in planning, in intelligence, in long-horizon strategy, has known that the thing they build will be used by someone they will never meet. And so they build it to last. They build it to work without them. Pravath was in the gallery. He had been granted observer status at the request of 3 delegations, a compromise the council had accepted with visible reluctance. I did not look directly at him, but I was aware of him. I was aware of every person in the room the way you are aware of a room's geometry after you have studied its blueprints for a long time. Directive 7 was not a surprise, I said. Not to the people who designed the Nightmare Protocol. They did not know the specific threat. They knew the shape of the threat. They knew that humanity, as a young species with an unusual profile, would eventually encounter a moment when a more established power decided the simplest solution was removal. And they built a system, maintained it for 31 years, updated it regularly, never once wrote its name in any document that could be accessed by Galactic monitoring, and made sure that the people responsible for maintaining it understood they were maintaining it for someone they would never meet. I thought about Arthur Penn's spreadsheet. 6 months between updates. Not because anyone ordered it. Because it was a fascinating puzzle. The Velhari Syndicate is composed of skilled and professional people, I continued. They failed not because they were inadequate but because they were operating on a model of humanity that was incomplete. They prepared for what we could do. They did not prepare for what we had already done. The Murini delegate raised a hand. She was a careful speaker, measured and deliberate, and she had been one of the first to respond to my broadcast. I acknowledged her. "Ambassador Dross," she said, "the documentation you provided included records going back 19 years. Records of operations against other species. My species has been aware of some of these operations for a long time. We did not speak because we did not believe speaking was safe." "I know," I said. "What has changed?" she asked. I thought carefully about how to answer. "The shape of the room has changed," I said. "What you saw happen in the past 3 weeks is not human strength overpowering the Council's authority. What you saw is information becoming available in a way that made silence more costly than speaking. That is a structural change. It happened because one word reached Earth at the right moment and a system that had been sitting quietly for 31 years activated and did exactly what it was built to do." I looked across the chamber at all 17 platforms. "We are not asking to run this council," I said. "We are not asking for special status or preferential treatment or acknowledgement that we were wronged, though we were. We are asking for a structure that makes the next Directive 7 impossible. Transparent process. Accountable decisions. Public record on any engagement with external enforcement bodies. A reformed oversight mechanism with real authority and multi-species appointment. And a clear prohibition on any operation targeting the leadership of a member species without full open deliberation. And if we do not agree," said the Velhari ambassador. She was looking at me with the specific expression of someone who is asking a question they already know the answer to but needs to hear stated aloud. I met her eyes. "The documentation we have already shared is not everything we have," I said. "But I want to be very clear that the goal of releasing any further information is not to cause harm. It is to create conditions where the information no longer needs to be released because the conditions that made it necessary no longer exist. We are not interested in destruction. We are interested in change." The Velhari ambassador looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the table. That was, as Ada Marsh told me afterward, the moment the session turned. Not when I walked in. Not when the broadcast was sent. The moment the Velhari ambassador looked at the table and stopped arguing. The session lasted 4 hours. There were challenges. There were objections. 3 delegates attempted arguments that were structurally sound but politically too late, because the political reality of the room had moved past the point where sound arguments for the status quo held weight. The Theric Collective countered each one patiently. The Murini delegate spoke with the contained force of a species that had been waiting a very long time to say something in a room that would hear it. Varith said almost nothing. He sat in his elevated position with his indigo coloring and his 60 years of observation, and he watched everything. At the end of the 4th hour, the chamber voted on a procedural motion to establish a restructuring committee with full authority to draft new council governance frameworks. The motion required a simple majority. It passed 14-3. The 3 dissenting votes were noted. They were not unexpected. What came next was surprising. 2 of the 3 dissenting species approached the human delegation's representative in the corridor after the session ended. They had voted against the motion. They also had, as it turned out, information they had been holding for a long time and had not known who to give it to. They gave it to Ada Marsh, who was standing in the corridor with a notepad and the particular alert expression of someone who has spent years paying attention to the right things at the right times. She brought it to me that evening. Another 40 pages. Different operations. Different targets. Species I knew and species I had to look up. All of them quiet. All of them described in the historical record as internal political changes or natural leadership transitions. I sat with those pages for a long time in the small room where Varith had asked me how long we had been preparing. I thought about Lorraine's card. I thought about the species on those pages, the ones who had not had a nightmare protocol, who had simply experienced the quiet removal and then rebuilt as best they could with what remained. I added the 40 pages to the file. We were not done. We were, in fact, only beginning. The restructuring committee met for the first time 8 days after the vote, in a room on the council complex's eastern side that had, until that week, been used primarily for storage. It was not a grand setting. 9 species, 1 representative each, sitting around a plain table with no elevated platforms and no manufactured atmospheric haze. The room had good light and terrible acoustics and a water dispenser that made a faint clicking noise every 40 seconds, which 2 of the delegates found distracting and the rest learned to ignore. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of room where real work gets done when people have stopped performing and started building. Humanity held one seat. Not a special seat. Not a leading seat. One seat, equal to the others, because that was what we had asked for and also what we meant. That seat belonged to Ambassador Lorraine Crisp. I was not in the room. I attended the first session as an observer in the gallery above, looking down at the table where Lorraine had her 17-page brief open and her pen in her hand, and I thought about the chain that had led to that moment. Colin Gray in a basement. Arthur Penn and his spreadsheet. Dorothy Ives and her windowsill herbs. One word traveling at relay speed. A music player that was more than a music player. A broken lock fixed from the inside. The first session lasted 6 hours. They drafted a framework for transparency requirements. They agreed on a working definition of prohibited operations. They scheduled 11 more sessions after this one. It was slow. It was careful. It was the right pace for something that was supposed to last longer than any of the people in the room. On the way out of the building that evening, I passed Pravath in the corridor. He was alone. He had been granted formal whistleblower protection under the new procedural framework, which was one of the first things the committee had agreed upon in its preliminary session. He looked different from the careful, posture-perfect man I had watched walk back to his office 6 weeks ago. He looked like someone who had put something heavy down and was still adjusting to the new weight of his own arms. We did not stop. We acknowledged each other with the slight nod of people who have been in the same situation from different sides and understand each other without needing to say so. Outside, Vetheraprime's air was warmer than usual. One of the suns was very low and turning everything a deep copper color, and there were more people on the streets around the council complex than I had seen in 3 years of my posting. Delegations from species I recognized and several I did not, moving through the public spaces with the particular energy of people who have witnessed something significant and are still in the process of understanding what it means for them. Ada Marsh fell into step beside me. She had a notepad, as always. She also had 2 cups of something warm from the small vendor stand at the building's side entrance, and she handed one to me without being asked, because she had spent enough time around me to know when I needed it. "How do you feel?" she said. It was a human question. Direct. Personal. Slightly unexpected in a diplomatic context. I liked it. "Tired," I said. "Good." "Uncertain about several things." "The committee will take years," she said. "Yes," I said. "Do you think it will hold?" she asked. It was the right question and not a simple one to answer honestly. The council was old. The habits were old. The species that had voted against the motion had not changed their positions, only their tactical approach. Even among the 14 who had voted in favor, not all of them meant the same thing when they said the word reform. Some meant it as a structural commitment. Some meant it as a way to survive the current pressure until the pressure eased. The difference between those two groups would become clear over time, and that clarity would be its own kind of reckoning. I thought about what Colin Gray had said in that basement room. A prepared state never stopped. I thought about the difference between a response plan and a prepared state. A response plan assumes the threat is finite. It has a beginning and an end, and when the end arrives, the plan goes into a drawer. A prepared state does not work that way. It does not stop because the immediate crisis has passed. It continues because the conditions that created the crisis do not disappear just because one specific expression of those conditions has been addressed. The Nightmare Protocol had not been built for Directive 7. It had been built for the shape of Directive 7. And the shape was still present in the galaxy. It would always be present, in some form, as long as there were powerful institutions and smaller species and the quiet temptation to make problems disappear without discussion. What humanity had done was not defeat that tendency. You cannot defeat a tendency with a single operation, no matter how well designed. What we had done was make it expensive. We had made it public. We had changed the calculation that powerful institutions made when they looked at the cost of the quiet option versus the cost of the transparent one. That change in calculation would hold as long as people maintained the things that had made the calculation change in the first place. We will keep working on it, I said. That is the answer, really. It is the only answer that has ever worked for anything worth keeping. Ada nodded. She wrote something in her notepad. I did not ask what. We walked through the copper-colored afternoon, 2 humans on a planet that had tried to decide our species' future 6 weeks ago and was now, carefully and imperfectly, beginning the work of building something more honest than what it had been. I thought about Sorvath. She had been in the comfortable London room for 2 weeks before the protocol concluded and the question of what to do with her became official. In the end, she had been released with documentation of the situation and no legal action against her personally. The contract she had been operating under no longer existed. The people who had hired her were now in a very different political position than they had been 6 weeks ago. She had shaken Dorothy Ives's hand before she left. Dorothy had, apparently, made her tea. Sorveth had looked at the tea for a long moment and then drunk it, which Dorothy later described as a sign of basic good sense that she had appreciated. I did not know where Sorveth was now. I hoped, in an abstract way, that she was somewhere she had chosen herself. I thought about the 40 pages Ada had brought me. The other species. The ones on the old records. Some of them were at the table now, represented by the restructuring committee's 9 delegates. Some were not, because they no longer had the structural capacity to send anyone to a table. What had been done to them was documented now, in a file that existed on thousands of relay points and could not be recalled. Documentation is not the same as restoration. I knew that. The file did not give back what had been taken from those species. It did not rebuild their governments or return their people or undo the years of reduced capacity and narrowed possibility that followed a quiet removal. But documentation is a beginning. It is the first step in the only process that has ever moved history in a useful direction, which is the process of enough people knowing a true thing clearly enough that pretending otherwise becomes too difficult to sustain. We had given the galaxy a true thing. What the galaxy did with it was not entirely our decision. That was uncomfortable. I had spent 6 years on Vethera Prime developing a very precise sense of what I could control and what I could not, and the thing I had learned most reliably was that the gap between those two categories was almost always larger than I wanted it to be. You can do your part. You can build the system and maintain the system and activate the system at the right moment. You cannot guarantee what comes after. You can only make after more possible than it was before. The twin suns finished their descent. The sky went from copper to a deep, quiet blue. Ada finished her warm drink and put the cup neatly in a recycling station near the corner of the building. She looked at her notepad one more time and then put it away. I will see you tomorrow, she said. Yes, I said. She walked toward the human delegation's residential section. I stood on the path for a moment longer, looking at the sky. Somewhere on Earth, people were returning to their ordinary lives, or the lives that looked ordinary from the outside. Clarence Hall was probably back in his Kensington townhouse. Dorothy Ives was probably tending her herbs, having noted the outcome in whatever private record she kept of things that had mattered. Arthur Penn was, I was nearly certain, already updating the protocol. Noting what had worked. Noting what had needed adjustment. Writing down the lessons of this specific shape of threat so that the next version of the system would be better prepared for the next shape. That is what we do. That is what we have always done. Not because we are required to. Not because there is a regulation mandating the update of protocols every 6 months. Because we understand, in the way that a species understands something it has been learning since before it had language, that the work does not finish. The threat changes shape. The galaxy shifts. What was secure yesterday develops a new vulnerability by next year. The only counter to that is the practice of consistent, honest, unglamorous maintenance. The Nightmare Protocol had not been a weapon. It had been the product of that practice. 31 years of people choosing, on their own time, with their own judgment, to keep something ready that might never be needed. And because they had made that choice, consistently, without recognition, without the story of it ever being told, 17 teams of experienced professionals had walked into buildings and found that the building already knew they were coming. That is not a miracle. It is not special human ability. It is not anything that could not be done by a species that committed to it. It is just what happens when you take the lesson of your history seriously and you refuse to stop passing it forward. I walked back toward the complex's entrance. The evening guards were changing shift. I recognized both of them by now. The one coming off shift gave me the small nod that meant long day. I returned it. Inside, the corridors were quieter than they had been during the day's session. A few delegations were still in conversation in small groups near the far end of the main hall. The Vethkari cultural attaché was reading something on a small device near the window. A pair of Murini delegates were speaking quietly, their voices below the threshold of the translation system, sharing something private in their own language. I walked past all of it and took the stairs to the upper level where the human delegation's offices were. Lorraine was still in her office. I could see the light under the door. I knocked. "Come in," she said. She was at her desk with the committee's draft framework in front of her and a pen in her hand and the expression of someone who has done a great deal of difficult work in a single day and is prepared to do a great deal more. She looked at me for a moment. "How was it out there?" she said. "Good," I said. "Quiet." The Murini delegates looked pleased. She nodded. She made a note in the margin of the framework. "I have a meeting with the Theric representative tomorrow morning," she said. "Early. They want to add 3 items to the transparency clause. I can have background material ready for you by 6, I said. "Thank you, Yael," she said. I went to the small adjoining office that had been mine for 3 years and sat down at my desk. The lamp was on. My notes from the day were where I had left them. Outside the narrow window, the city below the council complex was fully lit now, thousands of lights against the dark. I thought about the card in my jacket pocket. Lorraine's handwriting. "Remember that you represent everyone behind you." I thought about who was behind me. Not just the human delegation. Not just the mission. Every person who had contributed a piece of the structure that had made the last 6 weeks possible. Colin Gray, who had drawn a diagram on a whiteboard and explained what patience looked like in practice. The unnamed person who had modified my music player in a workshop I had never been shown. Paul Hendy, growing tomatoes in a greenhouse in Amaru, waiting without complaint for a signal that eventually came. And behind all of them, further back, every generation that had passed something forward to the next one, not knowing exactly what the next one would need, but knowing that the work of building things that outlast you is never wasted. We are a short-lived species. 80 years, more or less. Not enough time, by any galactic measure, to accumulate the kind of weight that commands natural respect from species who live for centuries. But we have been doing something with those 80 years that older species did not fully account for. We have been stacking them. Each generation inheriting the built things of the last, improving them, maintaining them, passing them forward with notes in the margins. An 80-year life is short. A chain of 80-year lives, each one deliberately connected to the ones before and after, is something else entirely. The Galactic Council looked at humanity and saw a young species with a short attention span. They did not see the chain. They sent assassins to remove a problem. What they removed was a temporary obstacle to a process that had been running for 3 decades and would continue running regardless of what happened to any individual within it. The Nightmare Protocol did not have a single point of failure. It had been specifically designed not to. Because the people who built it understood, from hard experience, that single points of failure are exactly what gets found and eliminated when powerful institutions decide to be tidy. The protocol was distributed. The knowledge was distributed. The maintenance was distributed across dozens of people who had never all been in the same room together, who did not all know each other's names, who had each kept their piece of it as a personal practice rather than a formal obligation. That is what the Velhari Syndicate's models could not account for. The thing that looks like informal, decentralized chaos from the outside and is, from the inside, the most resilient architecture that humanity knows how to build. I turned off the lamp. I sat in the dark for a moment with the city lights coming through the window, thinking about the 11 more committee sessions scheduled, the 3 items the Theric representative wanted added to the transparency clause, the 40 pages in the growing file, the species who had not yet spoken but who had begun, quietly, to indicate that they might. It was a long road. It would take years. There would be setbacks. There would be species that voted for the framework in public and worked against it in private. There would be moments where it seemed like the old shape was reasserting itself and the change had been only temporary. And when those moments came, there would be people sitting in small rooms updating their spreadsheets, maintaining their notes, keeping their skills current not because they were ordered to but because they had looked at the lesson of history and decided it was worth taking seriously. We are the species that has always done this. Not because we are exceptional. Because we were taught, by a planet that did not care about our survival, that the moment you stop preparing for what comes next is the moment what comes next finds you unprepared. We have never forgotten that lesson. We are not going to start forgetting it now. Somewhere in this building, the committee framework was sitting in Lorraine's notes with 3 items still to be added. Somewhere in London, Dorothy Ives was probably asleep, her herbs growing quietly on the windowsill in the dark. Somewhere in the relay network, the documentation existed in 10,000 places at once, beyond recall, beyond suppression, simply present in the permanent way that true things become permanent when enough people know them. And somewhere, someone was writing in a notebook or updating a file or maintaining a skill that they had not been asked to maintain, keeping something ready for a person they would never meet, because they understood what it meant to be part of a chain. The city lights held steady outside the window. I closed my eyes. We are the species that looks at a universe that does not hand out survival as a gift and says, fine. We will take notes. We will build something from the notes. We will hand it to the next person with everything we have learned written in the margins. And we will never, not once, not in any version of any future that might be coming, stop.